Before the 18th century, the natural world was known but not organized. Plants and animals had been observed, described, and named for centuries, yet there was no consistent system to classify them. Different regions used different names, and even within scientific circles, the same organism could be described in multiple ways. Knowledge existed, but it was scattered, difficult to compare, and nearly impossible to structure into a unified understanding. It was within this confusion that Carl Linnaeus introduced a system that would bring order to the living world. Carl Linnaeus was born in 1707 in Sweden, into a family with a strong connection to nature. His father was a clergyman with a deep interest in plants, and from an early age, Linnaeus was exposed to the study of the natural environment. He developed a fascination with plants in particular, not just for their appearance, but for the patterns they seemed to follow. This early curiosity became a focused pursuit. Linnaeus studied medicine and botany at universities in Sweden, where he began to notice the lack of consistency in how organisms were described. Plants were often named based on long, descriptive phrases that varied from one scientist to another. These names were difficult to remember and did not provide a clear system for comparison. He saw the need for something simpler and more structured. Linnaeus believed that nature itself followed an order, and that this order could be discovered and expressed through a systematic method of classification. Rather than describing each organism in isolation, he sought to group them based on shared characteristics, creating a hierarchy that would reflect their relationships. One of his earliest and most important ideas was the use of a standardized naming system. Instead of long descriptive names, he introduced what is now known as binomial nomenclature. Each species would be given a two-part name, consisting of a genus and a species identifier. For example, humans would be classified as Homo sapiens. This system was simple, consistent, and universal, allowing scientists from different regions to refer to the same organism without confusion. This change had an immediate impact. For the first time, there was a clear and standardized way to name and identify species. Communication became easier, and knowledge could be shared more effectively. The natural world, once described in fragmented ways, began to take on a more organized structure. Linnaeus did not stop at naming. He developed a broader system of classification, grouping organisms into categories based on their physical characteristics. In plants, he focused on reproductive structures, such as the number and arrangement of stamens and pistils. This approach allowed him to classify a wide range of species using observable features, creating a system that could be applied consistently. Although later scientists would refine and expand his methods, the core idea was powerful. Nature could be organized into a hierarchy, where species belonged to genera to larger groups, and so on. This hierarchical structure provided a framework that made it possible to study relationships between organisms, rather than viewing each one as an isolated case. Linnaeus published his ideas in a series of works, most notably Systema Naturae. This publication laid out his classification system in detail, listing species and organizing them according to his method. With each new edition, the system expanded, incorporating more organisms and refining the categories. It became a central reference for naturalists across Europe and beyond. What made Linnaeus's work especially significant was its clarity. He did not simply describe nature. He imposed a structure that made it understandable. His system turned a collection of observations into a coherent framework, allowing scientists to build on each other's work. At the same time, his approach reflected the thinking of his era. Linnaeus believed that species were fixed and unchanging, created in their current forms. His classification system was designed to reveal this order, not to explain change over time. While later developments in biology, particularly the theory of evolution, would challenge this view, his system remained valuable as a way of organizing knowledge. By the time his early work had spread, the study of natural history had begun to change. Exploration and discovery were bringing new species to light, and Linnaeus's system provided a way to incorporate them into a structured framework. The growing diversity of known organisms could now be categorized, compared, and studied systematically. Carl Linnaeus had taken a world of scattered information and given it order. He created a language for naming life and a structure for understanding it, laying the foundation for modern biology. And this was only the beginning of a system that would continue to evolve, shaping how humanity studies and understands the living world. As Carl Linnaeus' system began to spread across Europe, its impact was immediate and practical. Naturalists who had once struggled to describe and compare organisms now had a clear framework to follow. The simplicity of binomial nomenclature allowed scientists from different regions to communicate with precision, while the hierarchical structure of classification made it possible to organize the rapidly growing number of known species. This was a time of exploration. European expeditions were traveling across continents, documenting plants and animals that had never been studied in a formal scientific way. Each new discovery added to the complexity of the natural world, creating a growing need for order. Without a system, this expanding knowledge would have remained fragmented. Linnaeus' method provided a way to absorb this influx of information and arrange it into a coherent structure. His influence extended through a network of students and collaborators. Linnaeus trained a group of dedicated pupils, many of whom traveled to distant regions to collect specimens. These individuals, often referred to as his apostles, carried his methods with them, applying his classification system to new environments. They returned with plants, animals, and detailed observations, all organized according to the principles he had established. This created a feedback loop of knowledge. As new species were discovered and classified, the system itself expanded and became more refined. Linnaeus incorporated these findings into updated editions of his work, continuously improving the structure. The system was not static. It evolved as more information became available, demonstrating its flexibility and strength. At the center of this process was Systema Naturae. With each edition, Linnaeus added more species and clarified their relationships. What began as a relatively small classification grew into a comprehensive catalog of life, as it was known at the time. The book became an essential reference for scientists, standardizing how organisms were described and compared. Another important work, Species Plantarum, focused specifically on plants. In this publication, Linnaeus applied his binomial naming system consistently across plant species, creating a clear and organized list. This work is often considered the starting point for modern botanical nomenclature, as it established the conventions that are still used today. What made Linnaeus' approach effective was its balance between simplicity and structure. He did not attempt to capture every detail of an organism in its name or classification. Instead, he focused on key characteristics that allowed for consistent grouping. This made the system practical, something that could be used widely rather than remaining limited to a small group of specialists. At the same time, his method reflected the limitations of the period. Linnaeus based his classifications primarily on physical traits, particularly in plants where reproductive structures were central. While this allowed for a workable system, it did not always reflect deeper biological relationships. Organisms that appeared similar could be grouped together even if they were not closely related in a broader sense. Despite this, the system was a major step forward. It provided a starting point, a way to organize life that could later be refined as new knowledge emerged. Without this initial structure, later developments would have lacked a foundation. Linnaeus also extended his classification to animals and even to humans. In his system, humans were placed within the same hierarchical framework as other animals, classified as Homo sapiens within the animal kingdom. This was a significant step, as it placed humans within the natural world rather than apart from it. While this idea might seem obvious today, at the time it represented a shift in perspective. He further divided humans into categories based on geographic and physical characteristics. These classifications reflected the thinking of his era and are now recognized as limited and influenced by the social context in which he lived. They highlight how scientific systems can be shaped by the assumptions of their time, even when they're built on careful observation. Beyond classification, Linnaeus contributed to the broader study of ecology. He observed how organisms interact with their environments, noting patterns in distribution and relationships between species. Although the term ecology would be developed later, his work hinted at the idea that organisms are part of interconnected systems rather than isolated entities. His influence also reached into practical fields. In agriculture and medicine, the ability to identify and classify plants accurately had clear benefits. Farmers could better understand crops and soil conditions, while physicians could identify medicinal plants with greater precision. Linnaeus's system made this knowledge more accessible and reliable. Throughout this period, his reputation continued to grow. He became one of the most recognized figures in natural history, respected for both his contributions and his ability to organize knowledge. His work was not just about discovery, but about making discovery usable. He created a system that others could adopt, expand, and rely on. By the time his ideas were fully established, the study of the natural world had changed. What had once been descriptive and scattered became structured and systematic. Scientists could now compare organisms, track relationships, and build on existing knowledge in a consistent way. Carl Linnaeus had done something essential. He turned the diversity of life into something that could be understood through order. And as more species were discovered and more data collected, his system continued to grow, forming the backbone of biological classification and shaping how humanity studies life itself. As Carl Linnaeus's system spread across Europe and beyond, it began to shape not only how scientists named organisms, but how they thought about life itself. The natural world was no longer a loose collection of plants and animals described in isolation. It was becoming a structured system where each organism had a defined place within a larger hierarchy. This shift allowed scientists to move from simple observation to comparison, from description to analysis. But as the system expanded, its limitations also became more visible. Linnaeus had built his classifications primarily on physical characteristics, especially in plants where reproductive structures formed the basis of grouping. This worked effectively for organizing large numbers of species, but it did not always capture deeper biological relationships. Organisms that looked similar could be grouped together, even if they were fundamentally different in ways not yet understood. This tension marked the next phase of development. Scientists began to question whether classification should reflect appearance alone, or something more fundamental. At the time, there was no clear answer, because the underlying mechanisms of life, heredity, variation, and change were still unknown. Linnaeus had created order, but the meaning behind that order was still being explored. Despite these challenges, his framework remained essential. It provided a stable reference point, allowing scientists to organize their observations and communicate their findings. Even when adjustments were needed, they were made within the structure he had created. This is what gave his system durability. It was not perfect, but it was functional, and it could evolve. Linnaeus himself continued to refine his work. With each new edition of Systema Naturae, he expanded the number of species and clarified their classification. His attention to detail remained consistent, and his goal was always the same: to create a clear and reliable representation of the natural world. He treated classification as an ongoing process, one that required constant revision as new information became available. At the same time, his influence extended beyond technical classification. He helped shape the identity of natural history as a scientific discipline. Before Linnaeus, the study of plants and animals was often seen as descriptive and secondary compared to fields like physics. His work demonstrated that it could be systematic, rigorous, and intellectually structured. This elevated the status of biology, encouraging further study and attracting new researchers. His ideas also began to intersect with broader philosophical questions. If organisms could be grouped based on shared characteristics, what did that imply about their relationships? Were these similarities simply patterns, or did they reflect deeper connections? Linnaeus himself believed in the fixed nature of species, viewing them as unchanging units within a designed order. However, the structure he created made it easier for later scientists to ask whether species might change over time. This question would become central in the next century. Although Linnaeus did not propose a theory of evolution, his classification system provided the framework that would later support it. By organizing organisms into groups based on similarity, he created a map of life that others could interpret in new ways. When Charles Darwin introduced the idea of evolution by natural selection, he used classification as evidence of shared ancestry. The hierarchy that Linnaeus had established could now be seen not just as a system of order, but as a reflection of historical relationships. In this way, Linnaeus's work gained a new meaning. What had originally been a static system became dynamic when viewed through the lens of evolution. The categories remained, but their interpretation changed. Species were no longer fixed points, but part of a process of change and adaptation over time. Beyond theory, his influence continued in practical science. Naturalists and explorers relied on his system to document new species, ensuring that discoveries could be integrated into existing knowledge. Museums and collections were organized according to his classifications, creating physical representations of the natural order he had described. These collections became centers of research, allowing scientists to study and compare specimens from different regions. Education also reflected his impact. Students learning about plants and animals were introduced to a structured system from the beginning. Instead of memorizing isolated facts, they learned relationships, categories, and patterns. This approach made biology more coherent and easier to expand, supporting the growth of the field over time. However, as biology advanced, new methods began to challenge the original basis of classification. The development of microscopy revealed details that were not visible before, while later discoveries in genetics provided entirely new ways to understand relationships between organisms. DNA analysis, in particular, would eventually show that some of Linnaeus's groupings did not reflect true evolutionary connections. Yet even as these new tools reshaped classification, they did not replace his system. They refined it. The hierarchical structure, the use of binomial names, and the idea of organizing life into categories remained intact. Modern taxonomy, though far more detailed and complex, still operates within the framework Linnaeus created. His system proved flexible enough to incorporate new knowledge without losing its core structure. By the later stages of his life, Linnaeus was widely recognized for his contributions. He had turned the study of life into something that could be organized, shared, and developed systematically. His work was not about discovering a single principle, but about creating a structure that could support countless discoveries. This is what made his impact enduring. He did not just describe nature. He gave science a way to handle its complexity. And as biology continued to evolve, his framework remained at its center, adapting to new ideas while preserving the clarity and order that he had first introduced. By the time Carl Linnaeus reached the later years of his life, the system he had built was no longer a personal project, but a widely adopted foundation for the study of life. Across Europe, naturalists were using his methods to classify plants and animals, organize collections, and communicate discoveries with a level of clarity that had never existed before. What began as an effort to bring order to confusion had become the standard framework for biological science. Yet as this framework expanded, it began to encounter a deeper challenge. The more species that were discovered and classified, the more complex the natural world appeared. Linnaeus's system could organize this diversity, but it did not fully explain it. Why did organisms share certain characteristics? Why were some groups more similar than others? These questions were becoming more pressing as knowledge increased. Linnaeus himself maintained his original view. He believed that species were fixed, created in their current forms, and that his classification system revealed this underlying order. To him, the task of science was to identify and describe this structure, not to explain change over time. This perspective was consistent with the intellectual environment in which he worked, where the idea of fixed species was widely accepted. However, the structure he created was quietly opening the door to a different interpretation. By grouping organisms based on shared traits, Linnaeus had created a map of similarities. Later scientists would begin to see this map not just as a classification, but as evidence of relationships. The hierarchy of life could be interpreted as a pattern of descent, where species evolve from common ancestors. This shift in interpretation would come later, but it depended on the structure Linnaeus had already established. During this period, his influence extended beyond theory into institutions. Universities and scientific societies began to adopt his methods as part of their standard practice. Collections of plants and animals were arranged according to his classifications, creating physical systems that mirrored his intellectual framework. These collections were not just displays. They were tools for research, allowing scientists to compare specimens and refine their understanding of biological relationships. His work also contributed to the expansion of global knowledge. As exploration continued, new species were discovered in regions far from Europe. Linnaeus's system allowed these discoveries to be integrated into a single framework, connecting distant ecosystems through a shared method of classification. This created a sense of unity in the study of life, where organisms from different parts of the world could be compared and understood within the same system. At the same time, practical applications of his work continued to grow. In agriculture, accurate classification helped farmers identify crops, pests, and beneficial plants with greater precision. In medicine, the ability to distinguish between species was essential for identifying medicinal plants and avoiding harmful ones. Linnaeus's system made this knowledge more reliable, reducing confusion and increasing effectiveness. His influence even extended into economic and political considerations. Understanding plant species had implications for trade, particularly in areas such as spices, timber, and medicinal resources. Governments and institutions recognized the value of organized knowledge about natural resources, and Linnaeus's system provided a way to manage and utilize this information more effectively. Despite these achievements, Linnaeus's later years were marked by a gradual decline in health. He had spent decades building and refining his system, and the intensity of his work took its toll. Even as his physical condition weakened, his intellectual influence remained strong. His publications continued to be used, his methods continued to be taught, and his ideas continued to shape the direction of biological research. What is particularly notable about this stage of his life is the stability of his contribution. Unlike some scientific breakthroughs that are quickly replaced, Linnaeus's system proved durable. It did not collapse under new discoveries. Instead, it adapted, incorporating new information while maintaining its core structure. This resilience is one of the key reasons his work remains relevant. As the scientific world moved toward the late 18th and early 19th centuries, the groundwork for future developments was already in place. The classification system provided a framework that could support new theories, including those that would eventually challenge Linnaeus's own beliefs about fixed species. The structure he created was flexible enough to accommodate these changes, even if they went beyond his original intentions. In this sense, his contribution was both complete and unfinished. Complete because he had successfully created a system that organized the natural world with clarity and consistency. Unfinished because that system would continue to evolve, gaining new meaning as scientific understanding deepened. Carl Linnaeus died in 1778. By that time, he had already transformed the study of life. The confusion that once defined natural history had been replaced by order, and the diversity of organisms could now be understood within a coherent framework. His work did not provide all the answers, but made it possible to ask better questions. And in doing so, it ensured that the study of life would continue to grow, guided by the structure he had put in place. As time moved far beyond the 18th century, Carl Linnaeus's influence did not fade. Instead, it became so deeply integrated into science that it began to feel invisible, like a foundation that no longer needs to be questioned because everything stands upon it. The way modern biology organizes life, the way scientists name species, and even the way students first learn about plants and animals all carry the imprint of the system he created. What makes Linnaeus's contribution unique is not just that it brought order, but that it created a structure capable of absorbing endless growth. Since his time, millions of species have been identified, cataloged, and studied. New organisms continue to be discovered in remote ecosystems, deep oceans, and microscopic environments. Despite this massive expansion of knowledge, the basic framework Linnaeus introduced still holds. Each new species is given a binomial name. Each is placed within a hierarchy that connects it to others. The system has expanded, but it has not been replaced. This durability reflects a deeper strength in his thinking. He did not attempt to describe every detail of life. Instead, he created a method for organizing it. That method could evolve, adapt, and incorporate new discoveries without losing its clarity. It provided a language that could grow with knowledge rather than being limited by it. One of the most important developments that reshaped Linnaeus's system came in the 19th century with the rise of evolutionary theory. When Charles Darwin proposed that species evolve over time through natural selection, the meaning of classification changed. The groups that Linnaeus had defined based on similarity could now be interpreted as evidence of shared ancestry. Organisms were not just similar in form. They were connected through descent, forming a branching history of life. This reinterpretation transformed taxonomy. The hierarchy of species, genera, and higher groups became more than a system of organization. It became a map of evolutionary relationships. Scientists began to ask not only how organisms are similar, but why they are similar, tracing those similarities back through time to common origins. Even with this shift, Linnaeus's structure remained intact. The names, the categories, and the hierarchical organization continued to be used. What changed was the understanding behind them. This ability to accommodate a major theoretical transformation without collapsing is a sign of how well his system was designed. In the 20th and 21st centuries, new technologies pushed this process even further. The discovery of DNA and the development of genetic analysis provided a way to study relationships between organisms at a molecular level. Scientists could now compare genetic sequences, revealing connections that were not visible through physical characteristics alone. In some cases, this led to reclassification, as organisms once thought to be closely related were shown to be more distant, and vice versa. Yet even here, Linnaeus's influence persisted. The results of genetic studies were still organized within a hierarchical framework. Species were still named using binomial nomenclature. The system adapted to incorporate new evidence, but its core principles remained unchanged. It continued to provide the structure through which new knowledge could be interpreted. Beyond scientific research, his legacy extends into everyday life. The classification of plants is essential for agriculture, allowing farmers to identify crops, manage pests, and improve yields. In medicine, accurate identification of organisms is critical for understanding diseases and developing treatments. Environmental science depends on classification to study ecosystems, track biodiversity, and address challenges such as climate change and habitat loss. Even conservation efforts rely on the system Linnaeus created. Protecting endangered species requires knowing what those species are, how they are related, and where they fit within the broader ecosystem. Classification provides the framework for this understanding, making it possible to prioritize efforts and measure impact. What is remarkable is how natural this system now feels. It is difficult to imagine a time when there was no standard way to name or organize living things. Yet before Linnaeus, that was the reality. His work did not simply improve an existing system. It created one where none had effectively existed, turning a scattered collection of observations into a coherent body of knowledge. At the same time, his story reflects the limits of any single perspective. Linnaeus believed in fixed species, a view that was later replaced by evolutionary theory. Some of his classifications, particularly those influenced by the social ideas of his time, are no longer accepted. These aspects of his work remind us that science evolves, and that even foundational systems can be refined as understanding grows. But this does not diminish his achievement. If anything, it highlights the strength of what he built. A system that can be corrected, expanded, and reinterpreted without losing its core value is one that has been designed with depth and flexibility. In the end, Carl Linnaeus did something that changed how humanity sees life. He gave structure to diversity, turning the overwhelming variety of organisms into something that could be studied, compared, and understood. He created a language that scientists around the world could share, and a framework that could support centuries of discovery. His legacy is not just found in the names of species or the pages of scientific texts. It is present in the way we think about life itself. Every time a new species is identified, every time a student learns the classification of organisms, every time scientists map the relationships between living things, they are working within the system he began. And through that system, the complexity of the natural world becomes something that can be explored with clarity, built upon with confidence, and understood as part of a larger, connected whole.